remember what I put in under the title of tact, timing, and feeling as crucial elements of the sort of the basic structure of the psychotherapeutic work. And but I started, you recall, from a concern with perspective, and that is with the psychological dictum that what we encounter with each other is most fundamentally our individual points of view, are indeed unique points of view, which we have gathered and been shaped over the course of our life experience. And that the collision of these points of view is a first fact of meeting. The collision may be very quiet. The collision may be very violent. You remember last time I spoke about three of the most difficult encounters, collisions of points of view that we encounter. That is when someone announces themselves in a paranoid way or a megalomaniac way or a deeply self-depreciative way. But this collision is not simply, as I think we might first imagine it, a silent or painless, or I start to say psychological, although it is the meaning of the psychological, in my opinion. Nevertheless, the term psychological carries with it a kind of connotation of bloodlessness and almost ephemera, when in fact the mind in its psychological manifestations, or the body rather in its psychological manifestations, is as sensitive, as delicate, as easily hurt as the body in its cutaneous, if you like, manifestations. So that the very first of my orders of business in the collision of perspectives was the provision of some kind of analgesic or even anesthetic psychological acts, making possible a relatively painless encounter, lest the two people do what the physical bodies do when they hurt each other, either fight or flee. I mentioned that there are three relatively specific analgesics by which we render our relationships with each other relatively painless. That is the concern with each other's self-esteem, the matter of understanding, and finally the provision of hope or future. And then the second and third of my main the first and second of my structures, that is the provision of tact and now timing and feeling, constitute the overall central concerns, in my opinion, of all psychological meeting and treatment. Now, I also remarked that not only do perspectives collide, but they have the property of in that collision, or even in more happy encounters, having the property that I mentioned was ascribed to nerve cells, that is, of interacting by means of dropping from their internal content substances into the space between each other. That's what causes and constitutes interaction in nerve cells. And this is also true in the larger collections of nerve cells which we consist of. And so that this meeting of perspectives is also, in addition to being a collision, but in its sort of what you might say in its finer aspects, a matter of depositing in the space between ourselves. And space here, of course, is a purely metaphorical concept, since we don't know what we mean by psychological space. We tend to take it over from the concept of physical space. But anyway, in between us, there constitutes a ground of receiving, and this giving each other sometimes forcing on each other, or as it's so common to say nowadays, sharing with each other the properties of each other's contents, constituting a common, pool of our materials. This is the finer aspect of the encounter of perspectives with one another. In its most dramatic form, of course, it has been described by Christopher Gates as analogous to the experience that a lifeguard has in dealing with someone who's drowning. If you've ever had training in being a lifeguard, or had the experience of being a lifeguard, or in fact yourself been rescued, you know that there's an extraordinary, what should we say, conflict of interest in the experience of being saved. That is, that the drowning person, in their desperation, and for other reasons that I may not grasp, attempts to pull the saving person down with them. That is, that in a great deal of what you learn if you become a lifesaver, a water lifesaver, is to stop the person from essentially making you join them in their fatal fate. And at its most severe, and I gave instances of it, for example, in paranoid and megalomanic interactions, the patient indeed does carry us down very often. So that the collision of perspectives, constituting itself now as a depositing, or as a sharing, if you like, of mental contents and feelings, is a dangerous enterprise. That is, we may not be able to take those contents and process them in a form that is undestructive to ourselves or to the patient. And a great deal of the enormous and still burgeoning literature on the borderline personality is in large part a commentary on this experience of lifesavers being, drowned in the attempt to contain, particularly the affective droppings of the so-called borderline person. On the other hand, of course, this interaction of perspectives can be salutary, just as life-saving can be successful. I've often compared human interactions to banking, and I did it once here a few weeks ago, in which you or the patient gets richer by giving and receiving more. That is, across this boundary line of interaction, the giving and taking, the receiving and giving out constitutes a happy sort of bank, a rich bank. Banks are more successful insofar as they do this business of transactions. Furthermore, there's an interesting sidelight to that, isn't there? That as we do our giving and taking in the interaction of perspectives, you can say we take an interest. That's a broad term. We take an interest. This is a bank takes its interest, and therefore gains its additional reward from this experience, as of course we do quite literally, not only in the form of payment from the patients, but in the form of an emotional reward that taking an interest in someone constitutes. And then, of course, so often with the very self-depreciatory one encounters a bankrupt banking system where one passes back and forth junk bonds, inadequate investments, failed real estate, and one goes down with the person because one has been overcome by the deleterious exchanges as opposed to the happy ones which constitute our successful interactions. Well, perhaps I belabor these metaphors too much. And I think I do it in part I think I do it in part as a kind of delaying measure in approaching this matter of timing and feeling, because they're in my opinion two of the most difficult subjects in relation to psychotherapy. I will get last to feeling and putting it off almost as long as I can. And it is interesting because in the literature of psychotherapy, one seldom hears any kind of discussions of feelings. Granted, there's a great literature on catharsis, and there's a certain amount of concern about bearing feelings, but there's very little direct discussion of what's going on in the feeling relationship. But I think we have to approach it as boldly as we can. There's also a crisis here, because as I begin to talk about timing, I immediately collide myself with the state of the work, managed care environment, the insurance, the tremendous difficulties that are put on our freedom by the watchdogs that protect the purse in our midst. And I don't for a moment want to set that aside or pretend I'm making suggestions which I mean to be impractical or in an aloof world of protected practice. I practice myself as you do under these same conditions. And I want to bring my remarks into relationship with the demands of the contemporary climate. I do that in part because I believe that there is much good in the contemporary climate of managed care. I know that's not a popular view, but I believe it has corrected some of our lax practices and set us to thinking much harder about how we deliver what we have to do. And although I don't like it any more than anybody else, there are lots of things in it which resonate to my own take on this work. And I'll get to that very shortly. Of course, if we compare what I'm saying not to the conditions of managed care primarily, but to say something like an emergency room procedures, if you were like me, you went through the emergency room trying to get to the mock building this morning and found that this was locked below. So this is indeed a fortress to be entered. Anyway, but as I went by the emergency room, I thought of the fact that in the emergency room, of course, that one does not do psychotherapy in the sense I'm talking about. One does a lot of psychological work, and one does, incidentally, much psychotherapy, but it's not the primary focus. Because in the emergency room, what one is doing is trying to find out what one can know as much as possible in order to act. While the direction of these comments is very much in the opposite way. That is, here I am asking us not to know, told open, so that we can in turn not act, but give possibilities, open up possibilities for the future. So that in many hospital situations, of course, in the emergency room, one does not have the luxury of opening possibilities hitherto closed. One has to close down possibilities in the service of action. And there is a contrast, of course, between our longer-term work and this very short-term emergency work. But you'll soon see that what I am suggesting is very much other than that, in keeping with our managed care environment. For example, I'm going to talk about how important it is to start slowly, to not start intensively. I'm going to argue also that the fundamental basis of the work is something like negotiation. So that both the slowness and hesitancy almost in starting, together with the need for negotiation, not only with the patient, but of course now with the insurance company, all that is in keeping with what I think is fundamentally necessary for the dealing with each other's fictions. Now that I introduced here this expression a little prematurely. I'll talk a great deal more about it in the next lecture in January. But I would put it in your minds as a beginning point, because I think if anything collects and perhaps even clarifies what I'm trying to say, it's that phrase that psychotherapy is dealing with each other's fictions. And that's another way of saying that it's the meeting of perspectives. Because a perspective is a fiction, isn't it? You remember I gave you one of the most popular contemporary statements of the fictional nature of perspectives when I mentioned the artistic work of Magritte, who was always reminding us that we do not see a pipe, or we do not see the landscape. What we see is our picture of the pipe, or his picture of the pipe. And that as Immanuel Kant demonstrated, in my opinion, almost ad nauseum, that the noumena, the reality, is not reached. Only one meets the phenomena, and the phenomena are what we experience. That is our subjectivity. And so that it is, I think, fair to say that our work is about dealing with each other's fictions. Now, don't think for a moment that isn't very similar to a very strong strand in Freud's thought. You remember, his concern was with the patient's fantasies. Now, it wasn't organized in the way I would organize it as a perspectives. Obviously, fantasies contribute to perspectives, but much else does too, I would say. Nor did he, I think, acknowledge the fact that the physician or the analyst or the therapist is also dealing in his own fictions. So that the theme of all my remarks is, I think, as close as I can get to the heart of what I mean, is this notion of how do we deal with each other's fictions. Now, in this matter of timing, I want to contrast what I think is a realistic approach to psychotherapy with the one that we have been, for the most part, shaped, even dominated by. The model for psychotherapy that's taken from analysis is that of an experiment, of a laboratory experiment even. That is, conditions are set of a very rigid nature. The patient is repeatedly subject to those conditions. Material is collected and conclusions are drawn. The model for that is very much the laboratory. And it's not surprising that Freud, who himself was a neuropharmacologist, a neuropathologist, a neurologist primarily, and saw in the examples of 19th century science the opportunities for psychological investigation as well. But in my opinion, that is a deeply misleading conception for psychotherapy. I would present to you a different metaphor. And my metaphor would be, and there could be many different metaphors for this, but the one that I love the most is the metaphor of sailing. That is, sailing a boat. In sailing a boat, one is dealing with forces that lie outside the work largely. The currents in the water, the winds in the air. We don't even generally, when we sail, really compose the form of the sails of the boat itself. They are given to us. And our influence lies in pulling on the sheets, which, as you know, means ropes, pulling on the sheets and tugging or knocking at the rudder. Those small influences, of course, they have immense effects when they're applied by a seasoned person in the right way. But that seems to be much more analogous to the nature of our psychotherapeutic work. And I would contrast very sharply this sealed compartment of the experimental laboratory with its effort at total control. And this view of the ship, very little controlling the force of the winds, certainly not of the waters, and as I say, seldom of the vessel or the sails themselves. Just as the laboratory of psychoanalysis gave us a model of work in psychotherapy, which with certain set procedures, a great many commandments about the kind of interventions one could and could not make, the effort at its most extreme and in form of neutrality, silence, anonymity, which has always seemed to be utterly artificial. Because however much the analyst proposes to hide himself from the patient, the very way in which he hides himself, is like a wonderful statement of signature, of individuality. And if you will look, for example, as I have known many people whose devotion is primarily to analysis in its purest and most orthodox form, you will see the ways in which they try to hide themselves, how individual it is. And even if it were not true that very often one goes into their homes to practice, one walks up their driveways, one sees their cars and their bicycles, one moves really much closer into their world than sometimes they may do themselves. So that this notion of a set procedure in which the individual is hidden, is in one sense very faithful to the analytic idea. That is, that the patient is similarly hidden and self-deceiving and must be found. So that in that sense, if the analyst hides himself, it is only to put himself where he sees the patient, you might say. But that would mean that the treatment was a joint coming together in openness, right? Which was not recommended, even though in many cases that's actually what happens, and you see even the most orthodox analysts at the end of the treatment often revealing themselves much more. So that there is a sense in which that might be the way it worked. We will both hide like two children in a hide-and-seek game, and gradually find each other, and that will be the treatment. And that's a very interesting idea, and it deserves probably more attention than certainly I'm going to give it. Let me just say to our distinguished latecomers that I've been contrasting the model of the work as I see it with analytic work, in which the concept of a scientific experiment in controlled conditions lies on one side, and on my side the idea that our work is really more like sailing a boat, in which the great forces of the wind and the water and the shape of the boat and the sails really constitute the powerful things, and our authority lies not in the control of those conditions, but in how we pull on the ropes and hit on the tiller. And with this scientific experiment metaphor went, as I say, the idea of a rigid control of the conditions of the work. There's one way which I'm sure we've all experienced, in which the rigid control of the conditions of the work reveals itself in a dark light. That is, in your practice, for example, the issues of whether you charge for missed appointments. For today, for example, should the patient be expected to come? Who pays? Well, there is a tradition in part of analysis and psychotherapy that pretty much whatever the condition, you pay. Indeed, at its beginning point, you bought time from some of the Viennese people, and vacation, come hell, high water, even I understand death itself, you went on paying for that time. But once that principle gets applied, it becomes impossible to separate it from self-serving. And no matter how objective the conditions are set to be, the rage that's generated by the possibility, even if only a possibility of self-serving, that is the therapist protecting their income this way, constitutes a total destruction of neutrality and anonymity in any sense, and one that's almost impossible to refute. So that all of us who have played with those ideas, even practice sometimes that way, know that the rigidity of conditions is not wise. And instead, as I said just a moment ago, the essential property is negotiation. That is, one comes as two equal parties to the decision as to how this work will proceed. And I again underline that by one's willingness to negotiate, and also to negotiate with the managed care and the insurance people in mind, one puts the work on a much more practical basis than if one has very rigid conditions which either the patient won't like or the insurance company won't like. Now, the same considerations come up around those pertain to the beginning and the structuring of the treatment. This also pertains to the end of the treatment, because one of the goals of analysis was cure, very much on the medical model. And with cure, of course, there had to be definite endpoints. As the hemoglobin reached a certain level, then we knew the anemia was finished, perhaps. That was the wish, that we could define a procedure in the first place, and then the result of the procedure, definitely enough, so that one would have a sense of closure and completion. And indeed, that's the way people talk very often about psychotherapy and analysis. Was it a successful one? Well, but they mean more than just the fact that people liked it and got some of the things they wanted, but that it really was a rounded and completed thing. Now, as long as the Oedipus complex and the resolution of the Oedipus complex was the sine qua non of psychoanalytic treatment and the goal of psychoanalytic treatment, that notion had a beauty, a conceptual roundedness and determination that made it enormously impressive. And those of you and myself who have practiced where the data and the conceptions of the Oedipus complex and its resolution have really been strongly suggested, where the data has found conceptions of Oedipus and resolution incompatible with one another, have a very distinct sense that indeed that does happen, as I do in certain instances. I've spoken about that in a somewhat different way in a chapter of a book called A Safe Place, where I speak about Freud's invention, which I think Freud stumbled on a procedure which was extraordinarily effective in letting people grow up in a way by leaving them alone, but holding them so they didn't get someone else to infantilize them. And that I believe that is a valid conceptualization of a regularly occurring event with certain lucky, fortunate people. But as soon as the Oedipus complex faded from its central role in analytic theory, and all kinds of pre-Oedipal and other things, characterological problems came forward, the notion of a clear-cut conclusion was very hard to come by. Furthermore, inside this experimental laboratory, this intrapsychic laboratory of psychoanalysis, the treatment was to be judged by the extent of intrapsychic change. And that was judged in turn by changes of fantasies and defenses and transference, of course. And again, I think that has seriously misled us, because although it's important and very interesting and sometimes dramatic, it leaves out the wind and the water. And I myself prefer to judge the treatment not by these conceptualizations so familiar to us, but instead by the structure of the life. For example, whether love is entered into the person's to their personal relationships, into their work life, whether they have the constituents of a viable human existence, and I don't mean that those things are separate from intrapsychic change, by no means, but there's a tremendous difficulty in the judgment of success by measures of intrapsychic change. And that is that psychological data of that kind are readily forgeable. That is, people can pretend and present data that seem to simulate. And this is particularly true among psychotherapists who are patients, or analytic candidates who are patients, to simulate the conceptions, even though they may do it unconsciously. And because psychoanalytic knowledge is so broadly part of the culture, it's of course impossible now to distinguish what really constitutes intrapsychic change, and what is really has been learned as an social adaptation in the course of the treatment. This is a very formidable problem, and if you look at, for example, look at Judy Kantrowicz's studies in our own Boston Institute on what constitute successful and unsuccessful treatments, you'll see she pretty much gives it up, that there's no relationship between what are thought to be successful outcomes and most of the measures, even transference relationships, that she can indicate. And there are other studies that I think that's partly true of the studies from the manager people as well as others. So I would say that the soundest ground on which to place the completion of the work is not the results of the intrapsychic laboratory experiment treatment, but on the basis of how the sail is going, you might say. I mean, can you find the land? Do you know where you're going, right? Is it one hurricane after another, or is there some other moments? And there will always be hurricanes in life, as we know so well in Massachusetts. Is it other times when the sun comes out? And those are the things that are much more easily understood and measured. Furthermore, and here you'll hear this conviction from me over and over again, I don't believe that the central nervous system changes rapidly, and therefore, unless the life has changed, and the life shapes the central nervous system. That's one of the things we've learned from modern neurophysiology, that the brain and the world are in a dialogue with each other from the very beginning. And conditions, very specific conditions, produce very specific effects on the brain. We know this in terms of vision, in spades, in and out. In fact, 2 Nobel Prizes were given for some of this work, and whatever that proves, I don't know. But the brain and the world shape each other. If you want a beautiful statement of this, in an extraordinary book that our own Edward Hundert from McLean and the Harvard Medical School produced on the relationship between philosophy, neuroscience, and psychoanalysis. It's a kind of, you must read it. When he first proposed to me that he was going to do it, I thought he had gone mad. It's one of those things which in lesser hands would have been a vapid and intolerable balloon exercise, but he brought it off. And it's about thoughts and things and how they affect each other. Brain and mind affect each other and shape each other. And it's an extraordinary treatise. But it says much better than I'm saying at this point. But for our practice, for our psychotherapy, this matter of the conditions of life being the real fruits of successful work, this has a brain analog of the greatest importance. Because one of the things, as I said, I think I've learned is that when people's lives have successfully changed, perhaps, always perhaps, because of psychotherapeutic work, when they have successfully changed, patients do not feel better. It's very striking to me. They do not feel better. They go on having the same perspective, even though they're looking at a different world. They can't see it. Their brains won't let them see it. And it's a long time, varies in amount, varies in extent, a long time before their brain is gradually reshaped by the world they live in. And you can call that resistance if you like, or whatever you want to call it, but I think really it's fundamentally, it's a reflection of the fundamental property of brain to resist, so to speak, the world, even as we accept it. And you can think of Piaget's accommodations and assimilation notions, of course. So that we who ambitiously practice, and I think that's the right way to put it, that is, and practice with the idea that we will find landfall in some measure, and that's what we aim for, must also know that as we approach the land, the patient will tell us that it's a mirage, that it's not there. And even when they bump their prow against the rocks of ground, right, it'll only seem like another reef out in the sea for a long time. But all this is to make the simple point that in my opinion the work, as I say, is more like a sea trip than an experiment. Demands negotiation rather than rigid conditions, and aims at not primarily or exclusively, although inclusive in part, intrapsychic change, but as its final testing, really, the form of the life, and then the patient's capacity to respond to the form of that life. Now let me address all these things have implications for timing, of course. Let me take up the timing aspects a little more specifically. And by the way, I haven't quite got the rhythm doing this. Most of my teaching, like most of yours, I'm sure, is talking about cases in front of people, chatting back and forth, and I'm sure that when I leave that familiar ground for lecturing, an element of unilateral pomposity, I'm sure descends upon me like a great sheet, and I don't mean to say that in other words, I hope you will interrupt, or raise a hand, or shout in pain, or whatever is the response that occurs to you. And this kind of format encourages so lugubriously the taking of oneself seriously, And I suppose there are places when one should. God knows if one's paying for it, one would like the speaker to at least take himself somewhat seriously. But it some of you know one of my favorite sayings, which is from G.K. Chesterton. You remember the thing? Angels can fly because they take themselves lightly. I love that. And this, as I say, this is not conducive to angelic experience for you or for me. Now, as I mentioned already, the first element of timing that is important to me. One is that one begins slowly. See, we are like two ships in the night, these two perspectives. We may think we know the person because they dress a certain way, they talk a certain way, they look a certain way, they have a certain sex, height, weight. We have all kinds of things. But that is worth nothing to us. In fact, it's worse than nothing because it misleads us. Men dress up like women, and women dress up like men, and men dress up like this. It's on and off. Who are you? We know how you're supposed to dress. We know how you're supposed to be. But what are you like? And what really looks out from behind that proper garb? All these are the ordinary questions, but in psychology, they're the central matter. So that to think we know someone on the basis of these appearances is, of course, to throw up the game altogether. Furthermore, and this is bad news for us, to think we know people on the basis of their symptoms and signs and complaints is also a serious error. And even though we're going to have to respond to those complaints, we're even going to have to treat them, to hold our patient and to make our patient's life tolerable for whatever reason. If we treat them thinking we are treating the person, we are making a profound mistake. And the evidence for that lies in the earliest discovery in psychiatry, well, the second earliest after dementia, senile dementia, but that is of hysteria. Because hysteria, you remember, is the great imitator. It can look like anything. It corresponds to what syphilis was in the days when syphilis was even more rampant than it's becoming. So that whatever a patient presents as, it may be an hysterical manifestation. And therefore, we don't know what its implications are for any disease picture, because hysteria can imitate any disease picture. So I think we have to start slowly. We have to engage casually, if you like. I think it's often best to begin our treatment relationship by discussing the weather, the way people do in ordinary life. Fortunately, there's a great deal of it in Massachusetts, so there's no problem in finding something to talk about, because we're looking for common ground. We're looking to make the place seem comfortable, even safe. And we're looking at, we don't want to go right to work, like the busy surgeon in the psychological laboratory I spoke about. Again, we have, that's pre-anesthetic surgery, to get the person to lure the people up on the not the couch now, but the operating table. That's going to take a while, because the psyche doesn't necessarily come along very readily, does it? So we have to play a waiting, slow game. Furthermore, we don't know what the person needs, what the person wants, how much they need. So that in that waiting period, what I am mostly doing, I think, is trying to find out how well the person is. I'm trying to take a measure of the person's strength. So I don't overtreat them or undertreat them. So I don't do things for them that they're much better advised to do for themselves. And that business of measuring a person's health, I think, is the most fundamental thing we do, and also the thing we do with least training, equipment, or methods. So my remarks about it are a feeble beginning at that effort, which is so central. Because everywhere else, in the healing professions, the first thing you do is to try to decide how strong the person is, or else you won't give them X, Y, or surgery B. You can't do it. Or if you do it, you have to do it very, very cautiously. That's the first thing, the determination of health. Your blood pressure, your pulse, your color of your skin, or 1,000 chemistries tell you how well you're really functioning before anybody begins to fuss with you. And that, I think, is our first order in this waiting game. Now, how do you decide how well someone is? Do you know? If you have secrets about that, please don't mention them here. Publish them on your own. Because they will, if they're right and they work, you will be putting down markers that will carry your name, maybe even into eternity, right? If we don't blow each other up. But what I do is, first of all, I try to get a feeling for the presence of someone else beside myself in the room. Is there anybody home? I hate that expression because it could become a cliche for sort of deciding that some people aren't there, when in fact they may sensibly be keeping out of our way because they hate us. But when it's a measure of the extent to which the person can, has found themselves into my presence, the room with me. I have seen a woman for a very long time now, who who came in most lugubrious, most claiming to be terribly suicidal. Her life was all over. Everything was meaningless. She had no friends, nothing. Who yelled and screamed in my office for years. My youngest daughter's room is right above my office, and at first she used to come down afterwards and ask me, say, if Daddy all right, were they murdered by this woman, etc. But it became a kind of touchstone of my household. And I think it was kind of nice for the family, because it sort of said, well, if she can yell, I can yell. So good news. I don't know. But throughout, I felt about this woman that she was a very substantial person, and that she was free to yell, and that this was her sort of declaration of independence. And so I sat through, suicidal threats of the kind sometimes would curdle even my old blood. And there was a period when she did all kinds of outrageous, or her family thought were outrageous things. They weren't. I don't know. And I'd get calls from them because the family was convinced that the only person crazier than their daughter was me. But we weathered it all, and it's all come out really very, very well. But the point I want to make is that I thought I could feel this woman's substantial capacity. Now, what did I feel? One was a visceral presence, and that's impossible. How can you work with data like that? But the other thing was self-reflectiveness. I count that very high. That when she would say something outrageous, and then if you'd listen, in a couple of minutes, the contrary opinion would come in. Sometimes she was a two-person multiple. That she would have a right side and left side, and they would argue with each other. Then it was easy to see. But often there was this self-corrective, self-reflective thing, which I thought indicated that she was not all split up in smithereens like some of our patients, nor was one side totally in control. But there was this reflective dialogue, which I think is part of what we call taking ourself as an object. I talked about before, self subjective and objective. So that reflectiveness I always look for, and with her gave me a substantial sense of confidence. I also look for, and this is the one thing on this subject I've ever published, that is, I look for evidence of the capacity to connect and disconnect. How do you know someone can make a connection? Well, partly it's you feel their relationship with you, then you hear about things that they do. I used to think I could make a lot of how people talked about their friends, but unfortunately conventional views enter that terribly. So people will talk as if they had friends when they have none. You know, they're acquaintances. They're not really engaged with the people. But sometimes you can learn something about the nature of that. And you'll meet people apparently schizoid with nobody who have very deep relationships with objects, for example. And sometimes those objects function like people, and maybe sometimes wiser to have them than some people. It was Madame de Stael that said, the more I see of men, the more I like dogs. And there's a lot to be said for that. And so that I don't think we should be too critical about the forms of people's attachment. But this capacity to make some connection. And then, and what is even more important for me is the capacity to make disconnect, to protect themselves, to say goodbye when they're taken advantage of in some way. That's something that us here assembled as examples of the mental health professions have great difficulty with. We tend to put up with a lot. Indeed, we get paid for it, but we often in general do, so that we're not as good at that as we are at making connections often. This one can get so gimmicky about these things, but I like to ask, can you hang up the phone? There are people tyrannized by their parents who call at regular times, and the person lives in dread of these invasions. And the telephone is, extraordinary invention. I mean, not just all that wiring and the flashing through the air and the sudden appearance of voices, but the intrusiveness. If we get rid of schizophrenia and hallucinations, it won't change anything, because the voices will still come now from another place. The cable companies are probably going out of business because they can now flash those things without cables. God knows how they're going to come at us next. And there are people that call you, and when you pick up the phone, they begin to talk. I find that astonishing. Did they think I was waiting for them? They don't say, "Are you busy?" or "Is it you?" Even "Is it you?" They just begin to talk, and it's a very interesting thing. Maybe that's a sign of not being able to disconnect, because you've never disconnected. You're always in touch, so it would appear. And I've made it a habit when people, if I don't think they're in some kind of emergency thing, but if they're calling and then expecting me to be there and to go on talking without knowing what I'm doing, I sometimes just hang up. It's amazing, that kind of thing. It's as if we're waiting for them, like a waiter. Waiters are called that because they're supposed to be waiting for you, right? Well, for many people are waiting, think we're waiting on them. Well, those are familiar ideas, but as I say, I don't hold any great brief for my grasp of the person's internal resources, you might say, and they can be extraordinarily concealed. To people of great power can come to us in, sheep's clothing, if you like. But that, I think, is the work, the thing I try to do most in the earliest and most often prolonged periods of beginning That is, take a measure of the strength. And I will sometimes say to someone who says, "What are you doing?" In this thing, I would sometimes say, "I'm trying to get a feeling for how much you really need to have done." Maybe the best thing I can do for you is to say, "You seem to be a remarkable person. Goodbye." And some people come to you because someone has said they're crazy. Someone who's projected on them their own craziness, perhaps. And then, it's very nice to have a professional person say, no, you don't. You're not dying of lymphoma. You're fine. That's just a little. That's the flu. What are we waiting for? We're waiting for some gathering measure of health, and I don't like to think I'm waiting on the patient, in the sense that I'm waiting for the patient to do something. That is another unfortunate product of some of our analytic teaching, that one's silence is really a command. Say whatever comes to mind. Keep moving, keep going. And there's times when that was one of the great inventions in our work, free association. And it's priceless. I don't mean to put that down. But when we become people who are merely waiting, a tension is created in the room, which can be intolerable. What I'm waiting for is I'm waiting on myself. I'm waiting for something to occur to me. I'm waiting for a gathering impression about the person. And you remember I talked about that some early on when I spoke about our waiting to hear the noises of dissent within ourselves. This person is wacky, or this person is wrong. I don't like that. I don't mean that those impressions are correct, but they're recorded. And I think that's the sign of the collision of perspective. I can't understand them, essentially. I'm also waiting, as I mentioned earlier, for a new sense of the person, for something striking to come, something unexpected, even astonishing to come to mind about this person. Because don't forget, if this perspective is unique before us, and I think it almost certainly is, then our sense of it should also be unique. It should be like a new discovery, this person. And it should create in us a sense of excitement, as opposed to deciding they are a manic depressive or a, X, Y, or Z. We fit them in a slot. And there may be features that correspond to that, but that's not their perspective. The most typical patient, I always think the most typical patients are formed somewhere in the late life depression, involutional melancholia. There you will see people as if stamped out of a model. But even there, everyone is different. And the ways they get into it are quite different. So I'm looking for that sense of surprise. But above all, I'm waiting for an impact on me. Waiting for an impact on me. And I'm not trying to push it. Because remember, these two perspectives are coming in relationship to each other. And it isn't as if you're going to get that impression easily. Furthermore, there's going to be a lot of pressure, and I'll talk about that next time, to make up your mind. And then what do I say? What should I say? One wants to have something to say. I mean, you can't talk about the weather at these prices forever. What are you going to say? I try to observe the principle of the messenger. Remember, the messenger who brings bad news is slain. So if I'm going to say much, I want it to be good news. And we'll get around to the bad news. Don't worry. We'll get around to it. And people are pressing us for it, And when I get very hard pressed for it, I hear the self-depreciatory trend in there. I want to bring in some good news if I can for quite a long time. Not only because it's a relief and probably true, and if it comes out of my convictions, and it must come out of my convictions about the person, out of my gathering sense of their health, that news I want them to have. I want them to start from strength, not from demoralization, by which they may already be very much possessed. On the other hand, and this may seem paradoxical to you, I don't want ideas to collect in my head. I don't want ideas to collect in my head. I don't want to be formulating the case. Freud was the one who was most adamant about that. He said, do not formulate the case until it is finished. Because if you do, you'll close down your receptivity. You won't be able to see what's fresh and different if you've got the thing all lined up. That's what he meant by the evenly suspended or evenly hovering attention. You weren't supposed to concentrate. You were supposed to let it hover. And I believe that's true. Furthermore, when you collect ideas about the patient, or maybe whisper about them in the corridors, they become secrets from the patient. And nothing so poisons a relationship between people as secrets. And don't think your professional secrets are any different in their capacity to poison your relationship with people. So better to blurt them out if you have something like that, in my opinion, than to carry it around like a dirty gossip that you've heard about someone. I also wanted to mention that I hope that in our timing and in our concern with people, we're ready to do a lot of other things besides psychotherapy, whether it's giving medication, whether it's sending someone off to a group, whatever you think is important. I like to have that very open. People do those things anyway. They often don't tell us. There's several famous patients in the Cambridge system who have at least 10 different therapists. Most of them unknown to each other. Many of them free. Wonderful. What a gift. And as for the people going off to meditation groups and all kinds of things, I mean, my principle is I want all the help I can get. And if someone says to me, well, it's going to divide the transference, I mean, I try to be polite with things like that, but I think like, well, it's already divided, it's always divided. And I'm not sure I'd like it all on me anyway. And the reason I wouldn't like it all on me is that I might never resolve it. And I think that's been one of the great dangers of the concentration of transference analysis. It becomes an insurmountable thing. It becomes like a single-parent family. If you talk to single parents about their problems with their kids' separation, I don't mean it can't be done. I don't mean it isn't regularly done, but there are difficulties that can sometimes seem terrible, and there are ways to deal with it, but it's a problem. Well, those seem, as I tell them, casual comments, although I don't mean them casually. They constitute a terribly important part of this timing matter in which we do our work. And when I was a boy, my father was quite a chess player, and I used to play with him a little. Sometimes I'd read the chess books that he had, and I never forget my astonishment when I read in one book by a famous Dutch chess master that the essential thing in chess was timing. And I thought, oh my God, this game which takes forever, and people think, and if they didn't have those clocks going, Fischer would still be there with Spassky now, but he said it was timing because, and chess is much more precise that way than psychotherapy. Thank God psychotherapy isn't. But there's a moment, if you don't make the move early enough, you'll never get a chance to make it. And I don't feel that psychotherapy is like that. I think we have much more, especially if we treat it as a negotiation and a sea voyage. I think it's much more open than that. But there are times when you can wish you had put things down a little earlier than you did. But now I want to approach this dread subject of feelings. In order to try to make my comments about this faintly respectable, I thought I'd start out with science. David Mann explained to me once that Einstein's that the seed of Einstein's special and general relativity was a series of movements that extraordinary man felt himself making when he thought about Newtonian space. And have been lots of stories about this, you know, the image of the child, the person riding on the beam of light. And there are visual images that were important to him as he tried to stake out the difficulties he had with Newtonian mechanics and Newtonian space. But one of the things was a certain bodily movement he found himself making when he was thinking about it. And at one point, Einstein is reported to have said that it took him 20 years to go from that gesture to the equations of general relativity. Well, I say that because that movement was a feeling expressed in the body. It was a feeling. And Robert Frost at one point said that, that a poem is first a lump in the throat, a love sickness or a homesickness, and then a thought appears, and then the words follow. Well, those two comments are really the heart of what I want to say about feelings in this psychotherapy. And I want to illustrate it by another something from poetry. Some critics of poetry are very effective, at least with me, in making me come into relationship with the perspective of certain poets whom I don't spontaneously like. I've never liked Robert Lowell, for example. I've never read his things with the kind of feeling that Emily Dickinson gives me, for example. You know, that sense of the autonomic nervous system being just wired right into the poem, so that it's like your electrical connection. But in a book that Helen Vendler wrote, this is actually a book from Seamus Heaney, also talking about Lowell. Who you remember Lowell? Lowell was, to some extent, Lowell was Heaney's mentor in many ways. There's a fantastic poem about Lowell and that relationship. When Heaney talks about Lowell, Heaney becomes a little boy. It's fascinating. This older, wilder man, you know, who was afraid that Heaney was going to be too timid. And that was a wise prophecy, I think, in a lot of ways. How else could you become a professor at Harvard if you weren't somewhat timid? You know, who would ever make Robert Lowell a professor at Harvard? You know, they put him, make him a patient at Mass Mental of McLean, but not the Boylston professor of rhetoric like Heaney. But I could never get very much with Lowell. But then I read something by Vendler, and I fell in love. And it was all around this poem. Maybe some of you know it. I love it so much. I don't want to wasting a lot of time. It's getting awfully late, too. By the way, Alex isn't coming today. He's stuck out in the snow. So I'm giving myself this right to bore you much longer. This is supposed to be the last poem that he wrote, that Lowell wrote. Yet, why not say what happened? Pray for the grace of accuracy Vermeer gave to the sun's illumination, stealing like the tide across a map to his girl solid with yearning. We are poor passing facts, warned by that to give each figure in the photograph his living name. That knocked me over. And I thought I began to, and Vendler helped me know why, because it's a poem partly about opposites. He starts out by saying, why are they no help to me now? I want to make something imagined, not recalled. You know? Imagine. But Lowell didn't want to write poems about the imagined. He was right down there where it happened, right? And that was important to me because Cezanne is another hero of mine, and Cezanne was fighting all through the greatest part of his life against his imagination. He just wanted to see the motif, not to let his mind work on the material too much, because he had a wild imagination. If you've seen Cezanne's early work, you can see it's full of myths, almost surrealistic. He didn't want that. He wanted to get rid of that. And then he goes on, he says, why not say what happened, his commonplace way. And then, look what he does. For about 4 lines, he gives us, it could be Wordsworth. Pray for the grace of accuracy, Vermeer gave to the sun's illumination, stealing like a tide across a map to his girl, solid with yearning. Oh my God, there's the English tongue, suddenly in the service of an image. And it's the contrast between that, and he goes on and says, in his American English, we are poor passing facts warned by that to give each figure in the photograph his living name. He stamps right out what he thought. I thought that was so brave. It almost broke my heart. That man who was so unhappy much of the time. Well, the reason I'm mentioning that beyond my love of the poem is that what Helen Vendler did for me was to bring me into relationship with his perspective. And she was able to do it when he had a poem that gave me a much earlier perspective, that is the Vermeer part, that I was very familiar with. And then I could see by contrast what he was trying to do. So, again, you remember how much I made of this business of the math teacher saying to the child, which is bigger, 1/4 and 1/3? And the child says, 1/4 is bigger. And then they say, why? And they say, well, because 4 is bigger than 3. The contrast there. It's a sudden contrast between your view of fractions and this child's, together with the fact that there was the truth of it, the simplicity of it, comes there.